Hi, I am Zach Williams, and in this podcast, I will be exploring the concepts of human rights and why some human rights are more important than others. How states and international community enforce human rights and why states abuse human rights. According to the textbook, human rights is defined as the rights possessed by all individuals by virtue of being a human, regardless of their status as a citizen of particular states or members of a group or organization. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR, was the declaration adopted by the UN General Assembly soon after it was formed in 1948, which defines a common standard of achievement for all peoples and foundations of modern human rights law. The UDHR lay out five kinds of human rights: economic, social, civil, political, and cultural. Rene Cuisine was one of the key authors of the UDHR, and it described it as having four pillars of that liberty, dignity, equality, and brotherhood. Following the UDHR, two other key covenants were introduced in the UN General Assembly. These were the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also known as the ICCPR, which is an agreement completed in 1966 and enforced from the year 1976 that was details of the basic civil and political rights of individuals and the nations. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, on the other hand, was an agreement also completed in the same years at the specified basic economic, social, and cultural rights of individuals, as well as the nation's ICCPR and ISECR, are together known as the Twin Covenants, written, signed, and ratified around the same time. They affirm the rights to life and liberty and the freedom of movement. They affirm the rights to presumption of innocence, equal standing before law, legal resources when privacy and other rights have been violated, as well as freedom of thought, coincidence, and religion. It also guarantees freedom of opinion and expression, as well as freedom of assembly and association. The UDHR, as well as these two covenants, are two key figures in laying the foundation for modern human rights. The question that now needs to be asked is if there are some rights more important than others. The concept that some human rights are more important than others does exist. These are called non-derogable rights. Non-derogable rights include freedom from torture or cruel and degrading punishment, recognition as a person before the law, and a freedom of thought, coincidence, and religion. These rights are viewed as vital factors in ensuring international human rights across the globe. However, there are some instances where governments may still block these rights through their law. A good example of this would be the lack of freedom of speech in China. Now that we have discussed what the human rights are and what laws they cover, we must In the final segment of this podcast, I am going to discuss why states violate human rights. States can violate human rights for a variety of reasons. This can range from wanting to retain power to incapacity to revenge against certain political groups and also conflict, whether it be civil or interstate. Human rights violations can also be very strategic and instrumental in the sense that it is done if there is a perceived threat or if a new order or society wants to be formed. whether this be through ethnic cleansing or other methods. Examples of this are in World War II when Nazi Germany initiated the Holocaust in order to form this new order society group. In today's world, there are certain states that still do carry out human rights violations, whether this be in Syria under the Bashar al-Assad regime or in Russia under the Putin regime. But most significant and commonly known one is at the moment is the human rights violation against the Uyghur Muslims in China who have been placed in concentration camps allegedly called re-education camps by the Chinese government. We have already started to see how the international community has tried to take steps to enforce the human rights law in China. In July of 2020, the Trump administration placed sanctions on several officials in the Chinese government and even a top CCP party member, and so steps are being taken to address the human rights violations. However, as a result of China's economic strength and regional power status, it makes it much harder to effectively enforce the human rights law. In conclusion, human rights ever since World War II have been a key aspect that has been constantly discussed in the United Nations General Assembly and has evolved into a system that is somewhat effective, not only creating the international human rights laws, but also enforcing it. There will always be situations where the reaction may be a bit late, as was in the Rwandan crisis, but as a whole, human rights has improved since the foundation of the UN, and since the UDHR and Twin Covenants have been introduced to the UN General Assembly. Thank you for listening to my podcast.